Welcome, everybody. Tonight, we're talking about executive functions and ADHD, a crash course, organization and study skills for high school students. So I'm curious, before we get started, what grade is your child in? And we'll pop a poll in just a moment. And that poll will have 4 grade levels: freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So I'm curious if you could take a moment, what grade is your child in? Thank you so much for participating. It looks like we have a lot of freshman parents, about 33%, 35% freshmen, followed by about 30% of juniors, sophomores coming in at about 27%. And then lastly, we have some parents of seniors on the line, probably thinking about how they can rev up those executive function skills in their senior year to be ready for college. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you're here tonight. And the reason I ask is so that we can modify some of what we do tonight to meet the needs of parents with kids at all different grade levels. My name is Ann Dolin, and I will be your host this evening. For the last 24 years, my tutors and executive function coaches and I have been helping kids to do better in school and to relieve stress along the way. So tonight, good news, we have a specialist in the house. I want to welcome Kathi Gould. Kathi is a program manager here at Educational Connections. A program manager is somebody who talks to parents. Kathi speaks to parents, specifically parents of kids with ADHD and executive function, about the needs of their kids and helps them to create a path forward for their students. Her background is in education. She was a Connecticut public school teacher for 27 years. She taught from elementary to the high school level. And she was also an executive function coach for kids from the ages of 7 through adults through the age of 50. And in addition to having a master's in education, she has a 6-year degree in educational leadership. And furthermore, she's the parent of an ADHD son who is now 27. So you survived all this, Kathi.
We survived, yes. And you will too.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here tonight to give us some expertise when it comes to ADHD and executive function, really what the disorder is about and how we as executive function coaches and how parents can make a difference in the lives of these students. So let's start out with the basics. I want to talk about the connection between executive function and ADHD, because sometimes people think they're the same, they're different. Can you shed some light on this? Because it can be confusing.
Sure. So there's definitely a connection. And I think tonight we're going to go from kind of the general to the more specific. So we will get into details about what each of these really mean. But basically, if someone has ADHD, that is manifested in a dysregulation of executive function skills. So these are people that have trouble planning, managing time, prioritizing, starting a task, finishing a task, etc. However, it's important to understand that you can have executive function dysregulation without an ADD diagnosis. And I think lately we're seeing a lot of students that are falling into that category.
Yeah, we sure are. I mean, that's really common when parents, I know when you've talked to parents, when I've talked to parents over the years, sometimes their child doesn't meet the diagnostic criteria or is just having these issues. And it doesn't matter whether they have a diagnosis or not, we're still going to treat the symptoms.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit more about ADHD. Can you break it down even further?
Sure. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And you know that we have the ADHD with the H, which is the sort of the child who seems like they're running on a motor all the time, right? But you've also heard the term just ADD, which is the more inattentive. And sometimes there's a combination of both. But ADHD is sort of the term that we're using now to represent all of those things. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder, so it is physiological. And I just think that's so important to explain to teachers and parents, because Sometimes they think the child's just not trying, or they just don't care, or they're not putting in the effort. And they literally have a brain wiring issue. They have a very neurodiverse brain as opposed to a neurotypical brain. So it is, it's biological. 5 to 10% of the population are diagnosed with this. And it's actually what we call like a heritable condition. So it does run in families. So if your family happens to have that gene, then you're more likely to be predisposed to getting an ADHD diagnosis at some point in your life.
Kathi, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the manifestations. First,
Sure.
this concept of unexplained underachievement.
Right. So I think, Anne, when we go through this page, I think all of our audience is going to be saying, yes, check, check, check. I see this in my child, right? So the unexplained underachievement is your child who you know is bright, you know is capable, they're verbal, they manage well in other areas, and suddenly, you know, they seem to understand the material, but they perform really poorly on assessments, or their average in a certain class is dropping way below where you know it should be because they just are forgetting to hand in assignments. And you know it, you know they can do better, and it's frustrating.
What is this concept of being time blind, and also, you know, in addition to that, being kind of spacey and forgetful?
Yeah. So one of the manifestations of ADHD is this complete lack of ability to manage time, really, or to even understand the passing of time, how long things take, etc. Someone who is time blind literally doesn't see that there's a time issue. They can't manage it. It's either now or never. There's no in between. People with ADHD also have a lot of trouble organizing things like their binders, their lockers, their desks, even adults with it, you know, their bedrooms, their cars, right? And planning and prioritizing are big problems. It's hard to plan ahead. It's hard to prioritize what's most important. What do I do first? And the last bullet there, Anne, you mentioned this, is a lot of people with ADHD, it's not that hyperactive thing. It's much more spacey. So if you're in a classroom, for example, this is that student who's staring out the window. Or maybe at home, this is your child who you are talking to and you are looking at them and they don't seem to be listening to you at all. They're not intentionally ignoring you for the most part. They're spacey. They're just not really hearing you. And they're very forgetful. I remember when my son, who has ADHD, was in middle school, I got a phone call every single morning after he left. Mom, I forgot my violin. Mom, my homework's on my desk. Mom, my baseball uniform is in Mr. Smith's car and I have a game tonight. Like, so I'm sure all of these things sound familiar to parents who have students with ADHD.
And then lastly, we see students that are impulsive. We especially see this when kids are younger, but it persists until high school and certainly adulthood too.
Yeah. Yeah. And this can be a tough one because in younger kids, you see it, they have trouble waiting for their turn in a game, for example, or they're the student who the teacher calls you and says, you know, Johnny's always calling out and not raising his hand. There's no impulse control, but this does persist. And in high school, and this is the population we're talking about tonight, this gets a little scary for parents because high school kids make impulsive decisions based on peer influence because that part of the brain isn't kind of regulating that. And it also can make it hard for students socially because it's hard for them to engage in a proper age-appropriate conversation with their peers because of this impulsive nature.
Kathi, you mentioned that everybody with ADHD has executive function weakness. Can you dial it down to the specific factors that are actually a part of executive dysfunction?
Yeah. So there are a number of executive function skills that we talk about, and I won't go through all of them, but we all use these and need these to get through our daily lives, and particularly in school or at your job. So executive function skills are the mental processes that we go through every day. And there are things like planning and organizing, initiating a task, digging into your working memory, shifting or transitioning from one activity to the other, organizing material. So think of your child who's got the backpack or the binder that looks like a volcano erupted in it, right? So all of these are all the skills that we need to be working properly. And in kids with ADHD, they're not syncing. And then we have a really great picture on the next slide that kind of helps to explain this. So here we have an air traffic controller. So picture an airport, and you have your air traffic controller who is controlling hundreds of flights that are coming in all day long from different directions, at different altitudes, at different speeds, needing different runways, etc. If there were not an air traffic controller, we don't want to think about what's going to happen at that airport, right? It would be mayhem and disaster. So someone who doesn't have functioning executive function skills is having this chaos going on in their heads. So this same level of not being able to control all this input and output at the same time is what happens in someone that's has executive function skill issues.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Kathi. It really makes sense. And so I'm curious, in hearing all this, parents, what is your top concern when it comes to your kids' academics and what you're experiencing at home? What is your chief concern? What brought you here tonight? And so I'd love to pop up a survey. And I'd love to know, is it that your child is unaware of assignments, doesn't know what to do? Or is it that they can't keep track of deadlines? They don't know when things are due. Maybe it's organization and planning, or perhaps it's only starting at the last minute. They can't get themselves to start early. Interesting.
I want to hear these, Ann.
Okay, so let's see. We've got organization and planning. Sounds like 52% of parents, 53, say that that is their biggest issue. And that's followed by procrastination, putting things off at 31%, unaware of assignments, coming in about 9%, and then keeping track of deadlines, about 7%. So it sounds like that task of organizing, knowing what you have to do. And when I think of organizing, it's not just stuff. Like, we often think it's the binder, it's the backpack, it's your digital files, but it can also be organizing time, planning ahead for something. And that's what's often tough. Sometimes kids have the best intentions, but they can't always take action. And we see this a lot in organization and planning. They may know what they have to do, but they can't get organized enough and set a plan to make it happen. So let's talk about that tonight, Kathi. We'll talk about everything, but let's focus a little bit more on organization and planning now that we know where our parents are.
Sure.
So does that sound about right to you when you talk to parents?
It does. And it's funny. It's almost comical to me, because I think all of our audience must be thinking like we've been watching their households, because they know exactly these things they're talking about are exactly the things we hear from our parents all the time. And when I was teaching and when I was coaching, I saw this all the time. It's very common.
It is pretty common. So when we work with kids, and I know when you talk to parents, you talk to them about taking a team approach to academics, because it can't just be them running the show at home. It's really, really hard. And I've seen this as a parent myself. Both my kids have ADHD. That it's really hard to be the parent and be the tutor, or and be the coach or the teacher. It's hard to do everything. So when we work with families, we really recommend that parents are more like the coach. They're there to set the stage, to make sure that the child has a quiet place to do work, to make sure that they're asking the right questions, not taking really a homework police stance where they're too involved or micromanaging, but instead being really like the encourager. So we think, in what I found to be most successful is when parents can identify the issues like parents have tonight. Okay, it's really organization and planning, and then they can seek the resources to help their child. And that's really the best approach. So Kathi, can you talk a little bit about how we get started with kids and what parents can do as well?
Sure. So are we going to move on to our stages of change slide, Ann?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about when parents see an issue with their kids, what they do and what we do as coaches to help kids make change.
Sure. So our coaches will work, typically, like if someone calls us and they need us as a resource or a supplement or something, they will share with us what their concerns are, what's going on with their child. And then we have our coaches work with the students on any of these issues that they've mentioned. So whether it's organization or planning or time management, But there's a very sort of specific process that we follow when we do that, and it's based on some really significant research. There's a researcher called Vygotsky, I think back in the 70s. He came up with something called the trans-theoretical model, and from that, we have this, what we call the stages of behavior change. So if you are trying to lose weight or quit smoking or improve your study skills, the stages of behavior change explains how that happens. So think of this as a staircase or a continuum, and people are on this on several different places. You could be at the very beginning, you could be at the very end. But when we work with students, we want to know where they are on this continuum, because our approach changes, or you as a parent, your approach would change, or a teacher's approach would change. So for example, the first step of the ladder, so to speak, is what we call pre-contemplation. So at this point, your child is not even thinking before thinking, right? Pre-contemplation, not even thinking about a need to make any kinds of changes at all. So this is your child, for example, who has no system for writing down assignments, and then comes home and, I don't know, you say, what do you have for work? I don't know. Well, did you write it down? I don't need you to write it down. I can remember everything, right? You've had this conversation, I'm sure. So this continuum goes all the way from that stage all the way to the last stage, which is maintenance, where the student has worked with a parent or a coach or a tutor or a teacher and gone through these stages and started to adopt these strategies and approaches that are going to make them more successful. And ultimately, they get to this maintenance stage where they've actually changed or modified some of these behaviors so that they can be much more successful. And this is important for our coaches, because depending on where the student is on the continuum informs the work that's done in the sessions. So if I'm a coach and I'm working with a student who's in the pre-contemplation stage, there are approaches I'm not going to use, right? I'm not going to go right into, okay, let's color code all of your digital files, because that student is saying, lady, I'm not even looking at the digital files right now, right? So it's really important that we know where they are on this continuum.
And one way we do that, Kathi, is through a self-assessment. And this can be, this is what we use. It can, we've modified this for our kids, but it can be used in lots of different ways. Can you talk a little bit about how the self-assessment is utilized so that we can figure out what kids need?
Sure. So this is a great tool that our coaches typically use in a first or second session. And it's a informal. So when I was coaching, I would pull it up, share my screen, and let the student look at it and answer the questions. And you can see there are questions about, what do you do about recording daily assignments? How do you prepare for a test? How do you plan and manage your materials? But based on the answers that the students give, the coach knows at which stage of the continuum the student is at. And then again, we go from there. And it also is just a great way to sort of get to know the student and have them talk about what they know about themselves, right? They honestly tell you, well, okay, I don't use a planner, I don't want to use one, or yes, I've tried it, but maybe there's a system that's better for me. So it sort of facilitates a nice conversation about this.
I found that sometimes when parents call and they're really upset about something, it could be that, the night before the child had a big project due, and then they ask the parent to drive them to Michael's, the craft store, at the last minute, because they don't have any supplies. We've all been in that situation, and they're upset that the child doesn't plan ahead. But sometimes when we do this assessment with kids, they're not buying that. They don't want help with that, but they will allow help with something else. They might allow help with writing skills, or they'll allow help with organizing their digital files. There's something else where in the stages of change, they're kind of like at the second rung, or maybe the third, and that's assigned to us. I'm willing to get help. But for parents, when you have a child who you see a big issue and you're pushing hard and they're pushing back really tough, it could be that they're at that stage one, and it's the relationship is like this, and it may not work. So bringing somebody else in who can kind of assess the situation and figure out where the child is willing to get help can be a real game changer.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Did you see this with students too, Kathi? Have you worked with kids that are willing to take help one way but not another?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, because when I would talk with parents initially, they would say he won't let me help him. He won't. And I used to laugh, because I was an English teacher and my own kids didn't let me help them with their writing. So I understand this issue. But once you start to work with a student, I found students far more receptive to working with me when I was a coach as opposed to a parent. Think of it when if your child plays a sport, they'll do anything for the coach, right? For the athletic coach. But if you tell them how to swing the baseball bat, you don't know anything. So it's important.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I want to share with parents some strategies that we use that they may be also able to try at home. So talk a little bit about the read the room approach, Kathi.
So based on this assessment, right now it's sort of a way of gaining a readiness of your audience, so to speak. So, if you enter, say, a cocktail party, you kind of read the room. You want to know where everyone is and what's going to be talked about and that kind of thing. So this is a picture of moms knocking on the door, right? You have high school students. You're not going to barge into their bedroom without knocking. And before a coach would present a strategy or make a suggestion, we're going to knock. So we literally knock before entering. And some of the ways we do that are with the ways that we ask our questions.
So let's talk a little bit about those questions.
So some of the things that, and these are just examples, but some of the things that a coach might say are, would you mind if I shared my thoughts on this? Would today be an okay day for us to take a look at? Could you see this as a technique that you would actually use? So again, you're knocking before entering, you're reading where they are, you're seeing if they're ready. The beauty of these kinds of questions is that it allows the student to take some ownership of the session. And we're dealing with high school students. They want to be independent. So when the coach kind of does this surprising thing, like actually saying, what do you think? How would you like this to go? Students are sort of shocked by they've been given that autonomy, and it really helps to move the session along in a productive way.
The conversations can be great, especially with older kids.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the other questions that we shouldn't ask and other techniques that our coaches use.
Yeah, so all in line with facilitating this relationship and making it collaborative. One of the things is our coaches don't start with questions like, did you? So did you turn in that assignment? Did you email that teacher? Did you practice that Spanish Quizlet, right? We do we normalize situations. So we say to students, yeah, understand all of your friends are feeling this way. You're not the only one that's having trouble organizing your materials or managing 3 AP classes and a varsity sport. So we try to make it sort of a normal thing so they don't feel like they're the only one that's struggling, because that whole peer thing is so important at this age. We also empathize, and I mean, we have phenomenal coaches who I've heard some of the conversations that they've had, and they'll say to students, you know what, I get it. Yeah, that teacher sounds like she was being really unfair yesterday. Or, this is super frustrating and I get it. And you know what, you're right. You might not ever need algebra 2 in your life. I understand. But here's where we are, and this is our responsibility, and I'm going to help you get through this. So again, it's all about that trust building. We also talk a lot at the coaches, especially at the beginning when they're building the relationship, about specific feelings. So if a student comes to a session and the coach senses that they are really tense or anxious or stressed out, they talk about that. Because if you are a student with ADHD, you don't have a lot of extra bandwidth, right? So anything we can get out of the way so that you can use all of that brain power on your work or, planning, organizing, all of that. So if we talk about a specific feeling and acknowledge it and sit with it and say, I understand that you're feeling anxious. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I understand that. Is it possible that we can acknowledge it, sit with it, put it aside for now, work on some other things? I actually used to physically have a student write it on a sticky note, like anxiety, and then take the sticky note and physically move it to the side of the desk. Because when you externalize it, it makes it far less intimidating for the student. And you're not telling them not to feel a certain way, because that would be insulting to them, right? And the last piece is really about co-ownership, and all of this kind of comes together here. But the more our coaches have these collaborative conversations, the more the students feel like they have a voice in their own future, in their own process, and in their own awareness, and empowering them to feel that way just only helps the process to go more smoothly.
I love those suggestions, Kathi. Along with opening the lines of communication, we also want to facilitate an improved mindset, a growth mindset, if you will. Talk to us a little bit about the proper ways to use praise instead of just saying what we typically say, great job.
Exactly. And we all sort of default to that, right? So our high school kids are savvy. And they will see right through that in a heartbeat. So if you say, oh, you did a great job, they know that you're not that invested, right? And they know that that's a statement that you could say to anyone. So if our coaches are trained to use much more effective and what I like to call targeted praise and feedback, so the coach will actually look through, say, the introduction to an essay, and then say to them, wow, that introduction really makes me want to read more of your paper. I thought that first point was very interesting. And it opens up the conversation. So, and again, the student then feels like, wow, he or she really cares about what I'm doing, and they've taken the time to read my work, and this is really customized to me, and it's individual, and it's not a cookie cutter situation. And again, it's just all about improving that relationship so that the student is willing to say, I'm struggling, I'm stuck, I don't get this. It's very important.
I know that trust is a huge factor, and by asking open-ended questions, it really gets both the coach and the student on the same page. Can you talk a little bit about those types of questions?
Sure. So this is, it's this whole communication piece is kind of on a continuum of its own, right? So we're building more and more collaboration and trust, but these are the types of questions that we might ask. So a student might come to a session and say, oh my gosh, I have an AP World test tomorrow, and I'm going to fail it. And then I might say, well, tell me more about that. Well, because I failed it last time, and I don't know what to do about it. Well, what makes you say that? Well, I really didn't prepare long enough, and I should have spent 30 minutes and I only spent 20. And I don't know, maybe this time I should actually look at the study guide that the teacher gave me. And the coach might say, well, how would it work if you did that? Right? So just letting the student lead the conversation and facilitating where you can is the role of the coach. But what's amazing in this relationship is that all of this really helps the student be what we call more metacognitive. So thinking about their own thinking and realizing they have the answers. They know themselves better than anybody, but sometimes it's just a matter of giving them that forum and that opportunity to sort of dig through it and figure it out.
Because that really fires up their executive function skills when they have to do the work of thinking ahead instead of just being in the now, which most of our students actually are.
Right.
By asking those open-ended questions, it makes them be reflective, but then also think ahead about next steps. So I wanted to just shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the role of the parent and how outside help can really be such a magical thing for kids with ADHD and executive function issues. So when a child gets outside help, and it can be from a teacher that they see at lunch or after school, it could be, a coach that maybe works with them after a game. It could be an executive function coach. It could be a college student down the street. But really, having outside help takes the parent out of the equation. So the parent doesn't have to be the taskmaster. And that is really the last thing parents want to be in high school. By ninth grade, kids should be able to be fairly independent, where a parent isn't having to oversee everything. And also, outside help allows kids to get more buy-in because they're not hearing that, did you do that? Did you do this? Did you turn in that? As you mentioned, Kathi. And then lastly, I think it helps kids to increase their motivation. One thing we hear from parents is, my child may not buy into extra help because they're worried that this is just more work for them to do. But the key, anytime you're providing help to your child, is that the child actually learns these skills in tandem with their academic work so that they feel like they're getting something done too. Kathi, can you talk a little bit about this process and what you see when you work with kids in terms of the value that outside help can bring?
Yeah, I think, and I agree with everything you said. And I think it's so important too, because we've talked about that we work with a team approach, including the family, of course, but there does come a point where the family, the parents, you've set the foundation, you've provided the environment, but maybe your child just isn't, they don't want your help, and it's becoming unhealthy for the family dynamic. So this is a way to, and I have a lot of parents that call me about this. I've had parents that actually say, you mean I don't have to check the planner every night? Some parents really want a little bit of a break from this academic piece of it. And because our coaches do the executive function skill work through the students' assignments, the students get work done, which again, totally increases the buy-in because they say, oh, you mean if I work with this coach for an hour, I can also get this assignment completed? And then completing assignments increases the confidence, the snowball gets rolling. They're more motivated to do more things when they find that they can actually complete things and hit submit instead of being stuck under a pile of, unfinished assignments. And then they feel like they're drowning.
Yeah, we hear that quite often. And if you feel that Kathi could be of assistance to you and you want to schedule a call with her to hear about outside help that might benefit your child, or just kind of talk about your child's situation and brainstorm some ideas, we are more than happy to help. And if you hold up your phone to the QR code, this goes actually right to Kathi's calendar, and you can schedule a 20-minute call with her and just talk and brainstorm about your child. So I know that, Kathi, you're so good at talking to parents. You talk to so many parents, and
I do. I love talking to parents.
All right. So I want to shift a little bit and discuss some of the issues, like the really nitty-gritty of the issues that we mentioned earlier. You talked about this initially when you said some kids are time blind. Can you talk a little bit about ways that you help kids that don't have a sense of time?
Sure. So we're going to talk about this time management piece, and also we're going to get into that initial concern of the parents about the organizing and planning. So I'm going to show you two samples, kind of templates of an activity that a coach could do with a student to increase these kinds of issues or areas. So the first one is about prioritizing and managing time. Students that are time blind, they don't know how long it takes to do something. So, and you might be giggling right now thinking, oh my gosh, this is my daughter, this is my son. They say they have a half hour of homework and they're upstairs for 3 hours. Or, they think a task is going to take them 10 minutes and they go out in the car and they're gone half the day. So this is an idea that a coach could do with the student. And I like to use food as a motivator, because what high school student isn't motivated by food? But if we think in terms of bites, munchers, and gobblers, so a bite being something that's a single step, quick bite, a small task that only takes a couple of minutes. And you would sit down with the student and you'd say, well, what are your bites? And they might say, well, I have to submit a question of the day to Google Classroom. I have to send an email to my bio teacher. And oh yeah, I have to run through that quiz that's going to take me like 50 seconds. Okay, so we put those in the bites column. The munchers column is things that are a little bit bigger, a little bit more of a mouthful, metaphorically, and they might take an hour. So, I have to do this Cornell notes template on a history chapter, and I have a lab report due for bio. So those are sort of middle of the road tasks. And then maybe you say, okay, well, I see on your calendar, you've got some big essay due, or you've got a big project due. Those are things that might take days. So having the students map it out on this type of plan helps them to sort of differentiate what tasks are going to take how much time, and then they can plan accordingly. And the next template I'm going to show you sort of takes this idea and takes it a step further. So this, when we're talking about time, as well as organizing time, organizing when you're going to study, etc. So now this is taking all these tasks that the student knows he or she has to do, and a coach might do this with the student day to day. This particular chart that we're sharing with you happens to be a weekly one. But in the task column, the coach works with the student to say, let's write down everything you have to do this week, including, if you notice, baseball practice is on here, because that's something that takes away time from maybe doing a homework assignment. So it's important to put everything on it. And then the middle column is how much time does it actually take to do one of these things? So for example, the reading log, the student says, oh, it's going to take me 30 minutes. And the last step of this, the coach would say, well, when are you going to do this? And we encourage the student to pick a very specific time, not just say, oh, I'll do it on Monday, right? So no, I'm free Monday from 7:50 to 8:20. Make it very specific. This type of this type of template has so many advantages, but what it really does is helps the student determine how much time things are going to take. So maybe a coach meets with a student and they fill this out, and then maybe the next day they touch base with them and the student says, you know something, that reading log took me an hour. And the coach says, well, what happened? And they said, well, I actually hadn't done the reading yet. So it wasn't just the reading log. So then the coach might say, well, then next time we make reading one of the tasks a half an hour, then the log is another half an hour. So that kind of reflective conversational piece that the coach and the student have starts to help the student learn about how much time things take and starts to erase some of that time blindness.
You recommend that students then take this type of map and put it into Google Calendar, or where does it go from here?
So yeah, I love the idea of, so we sort of started with the bites and munchers and gobblers was kind of the big picture, right? Then we get more specific with this one. And then I'm all about putting it in some kind of calendar, planner, some device. I'm also, and most of our coaches are, we're very much about the empowerment piece. So we would say to a student who is at the appropriate stage on the continuum, right? Which calendar do you prefer? Do you like the calendar in Google Classroom? Would you rather use a paper planner? Would you rather write each task on an index card and then rip it in half when it's done? Would you rather make a checklist? Whatever it is, but it is important to take it from here to a sort of a more structured setting. And, and the more kids do this, and this is why, the consistency and the routine and the structure is so important, all these things start to become internalized. And after, several sessions, kids start to do this on their own without having to think about it.
And that kind of leads me to what type of help is best. It's been my experience that in working with lots of kids over the years that periodic help isn't really worth it, like every other week or, once a month. And once a week is helpful. But for a student with ADHD or executive function issues, that it's really twice a week that has the greatest impact, because it's not only consistent but we can also provide accountability. Can you talk a little bit about the support that most kids with ADHD and executive function need?
Yeah, the twice a week is ideal. I mean, in an ideal world, if we all had more free time, 3 times a week would be great. I mean, it's never too much, really. But I think what's really important is these students need consistency, they need structure, they need repetition, they need practice. And the analogy I always like to use is, we have, our brains there's something called neuroplasticity, right? So we can actually grow new neural pathways in our brain. We're not stuck with what we were born with. We can change things. So if you were to run through the woods to someone's house, there's no path. It would be really difficult the first 15 times you did it. You'd be tripping, you'd be catching your foot on a vine, etc. The more and more and more you do it, the path creates itself. And so by the 30th time that you're running through the woods, it's easy. It's a very fluid, easy path. That's what we do with this. Do it over and over and over in the same way every time. And those pathways actually get created in the brain. And obviously the idea behind this coaching is, our statement at the bottom about the safety net. We start with a lot of support and a lot of scaffolding and think of it as a safety net. But the goal eventually is to graduate the student at whatever point is appropriate for him or her to independence.
And that means they're kind of getting up that ladder of their behavior change ladder when they're able to get to the top and they've used the strategies, they've practiced them over and over, and they've become automatic and independent around it.
That's right.
How do you get kids to that piece? What are the steps that coaches take to get kids to that point of independence?
Yeah, so we're talking about this consistency and the repetition, et cetera. And every student is individual and our coaches customize every session. However, there are 4 steps that all the coaches do, and it becomes a pattern and the students start to anticipate it. So the first step is all the coaches will check the student's learning management system. So whether it's Canvas or Schoology or Google Classroom, they'll have them pull up the page, share your screen, please, so I can see it, and then walk through it with the student. Oh, looks like you have an English essay due on Friday, or looks like there's a bio quiz tomorrow. And then talk about what do we need to do to prepare for that? What resources might you need? What time can you put aside for this? Sometimes they'll actually go into the grade part of the program and say, looks like there's missing assignments here. Let's go look at that. And invariably the student will say, oh, I did that. And then they get to the page and sure enough, it's done. And they forgot to click submit. So the coach spends a lot of time on this digital arena, which for the kids is now much more familiar to them, not so much to us, because we didn't go through school with this, but it's still really daunting. And especially if I had students that were moving from one district to another that were using different learning management systems. It's nice to have someone help you walk through this. And it's another thing that parents really don't want to have to deal with. So let the coach do it.
How about the second step, having kids write down their assignments? You talked a little bit about this with the munchers, the gobblers, the bites.
Yeah. So for some reason, students are resistant, some of them, and again, depending on where they are in the continuum, to write these things down. But this goes back to what I was saying about the feelings. We need to externalize things for these students. So part of the session is having the student record somewhere on that kind of a chart, like the bites, munchers, and gobblers, in a planner, on the interactive whiteboard that the coach and the student are using together, in the notes section of the phone, somewhere, to write them down, so that, again, they're taken out of the head and externalized. And it's also a great way for them to have a visual of it instead of trying to hold it up here. And then super satisfying when you can cross things off your list as you complete them.
And Kathi, what about completing assignments?
So this is the part that helps us get a lot of buy-in from our kids, because coaches will do work with the students. So they're teaching those executive function skills, the organizing, the planning, all of those things that are concerning to parents through the schoolwork. So a student might come to a session and say, I've got this 5-paragraph essay. I don't know where to start. I don't know the first thing. I don't know how to break this into pieces. You've got to help me make this more manageable. So typically in a session, when I was coaching, I used to say to students, what's the worst thing you have to do today? Or what's the thing you're not going to do if I'm not sitting here with you? So it's kind of the old worst first. And then, you sit there, you sort of virtually hold their hand and help them through it and facilitate the experience for them. And by the end of the session, when they've completed something, they feel good about themselves. And now they can turn it in, and they're not going to be that, sitting in the classroom when the teacher says, where's your assignment? Do it. And starting down that horrible, self-confidence downslide that we want to stop as much as possible.
And then the last part of a session, and this is my personal favorite part in working with lots of kids, is to reflect and think ahead.
Yeah, this piece is super important, Ann, and I agree with you. At the end of a session, coaches will just talk to the student. How do you think this went tonight? What went well for you? What strategies did we use that you think you might really go forward with? What strategies did you not like? Or what do you not plan to use? And just helping them to, again, metacognition, thinking about the thinking. Also to set goals. Okay, this is what we got through tonight. Let's look at the calendar again. What would we like to work towards for our next session?
I love those. And I also love asking kids, and parents can ask the same question, to anticipate that something is going to be hard, because it will. And kids with ADHD and executive function issues, that's where they get stuck. When they think it's going to be smooth sailing, they come upon an obstacle and they just kind of freeze. And that's when they start to procrastinate. They won't follow through on the assignment. So I like asking, what could get in your way? And often I'd hear things like, well, I really don't like this assignment, and I have a habit of watching YouTube videos when I don't want to do something. Or I don't know, there's this big text strand with my friends. We're on a group text, and that distracts me. So even asking kids, what might you do if that happens? Let's talk about some strategies, is super helpful. Some of my favorite things to talk to kids about is using a timer. I love timers. I'm a huge fan of timers. Using the Pomodoro method. Mm-hmm. There's research that shows that kids' attention during homework for high schoolers isn't really more than 25 minutes. So setting the timer for 25 minutes. So it's like having that discussion about those little techniques that can really make a big difference.
Yeah, it's almost like a dress rehearsal, Ann, right? So you say, okay, what might go wrong? And if it does, what are we going to do about it, right? And I know we've talked about this professionally as colleagues, but students with ADHD, they have a problem with cognitive flexibility. So if they come across an obstacle, they don't know what their options are. It's hard for them to think outside the box. So you're exactly right in saying, if we talk to them about the possibility that this might happen, they can sort of exercise thinking outside the box. And what are some of my options before it happens and it makes them panic and freeze?
Yeah, for sure, Kathi. So I want to go to questions from parents, because I see that we have a bunch of questions in the chat. And if you have a question that you want to ask either one of us, please put it in the chat right now, and we will get to it in just a second. So again, we're here to help. If you have a child who would benefit from some extra help, Kathi would be more than happy to talk to you. And again, you can contact her by emailing Kathi, Kathi, at ectutoring.com. You can scan a QR code, or you can go to our website at ectutoring.com to get connected with her. All right, so let's go to Q&A. And I want to also mention that at the end, after we're done with questions, you will see a survey pop up on your screen. And if you could be so kind as to tell us what was helpful to you tonight, what you'd like to see more of, or something different, that helps us to plan ahead. All right, so Kathi, let's talk about questions. Let's see.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to go back to some of our early ones. Great. Are you sharing the assessment? And yes, we can send out the assessment if that would be helpful to you, for sure. Beth said, it seems like there are more than 5 to 10% of kids with ADHD. And Beth, I would agree with you. Living in the Northern Virginia area, it seems like more kids than that have a diagnosis, but statistically speaking, that is a nationwide sample. Wendy asked, how do you fill in the daily planner when you don't know all of your assignments at the beginning of the week? Some teachers may assign work daily. Would you like to take that one, Kathi?
Sure. So, I mean, that particular template I showed could be used for a day at a time or a week at a time. And you're right, sometimes teachers don't give them the full week ahead to know, but then it could just be used on a daily basis. So that way, every time the coach sits down with the student, they know what they have to do for that day. Typically, if you get more familiar with the learning management systems, the long-term assignments are there and they are posted usually on a big calendar page and the student can look ahead. But sometimes students and parents don't even know that that's there because there's a lot to dig through, which is why step one of our session is so important, because the coaches go through that system so the students know how to look for the long-term things that are probably embedded there somewhere.
Carolyn asks, what frequency do you recommend the planning table be completed?
Again, I mean, with the coach each time, but if we could train the student to do it on his or her own on a daily basis, that would be the ultimate goal. And, you know, I've worked with students that most of the students that I worked with liked doing it a week out, you know, because they like to fill in all of their activities. We know all these kids are so busy, and we use it as a tool to say, like, for example, you have a varsity baseball player. I've got a game. Okay, you're not going to be home till 9:30 on Wednesday night. So let's not wait to start studying for the big test on Wednesday because you don't have any time then. So it sort of helps to sort of, you know, level the playing field for the week, if you will.
Great. Yeah. And to that point, I really love setting the stage. You know, often I recommend to parents to sit down with your kids at the beginning of the week, Sunday, for example, and even if it's just 15 minutes, and say, let's talk about the week ahead. What do you have coming up? Meaning, do you have any big projects or tests? And that's the time for a high school student. And honestly, high school students are not going to say like, oh, gee, mom, let's see, I have the biology test and I got to do that English essay. It's just not going to say that to us. But it is a time when, you know, us as adults, we might take out our calendar or open our phone with Outlook and look at all of our appointments coming up, confirm appointments. But for kids, they can look at what they have coming up those due dates. Often what I found in our work is when you don't do that, kids kind of just show up on Monday, like without a plan for the week. And then by Monday, they're already behind. And that's just not a good feeling for anybody. So I like front loading the week. Okay, how do you get a student to work on a calendar like this when they don't think they need it? Meaning they think they can handle their workload without any structure.
Yeah, so this is a classic example of a student who's in the pre-contemplation stage, right? And this is very frustrating. And I'll be 100% honest with you, it's not going to happen in one session. So it might be 2 or 3, then the student finally realizes the coach is actually there to facilitate and help. And then a coach might do something like a cost benefit kind of situation. Okay, so, you know, what's the cost of not writing it down, not putting it on a calendar? What's the benefit of doing it? Let's weigh that out. You know, hey, if it even gives you a night, like what happens when you go home and you haven't written things on your calendar? Oh my gosh, my dad's yelling at me. It's a horrible night. I don't get to watch TV. All right. So what would it look like if you tried that? Do you think maybe dad would be a little happier that night? And then they might say, all right, that might be a reason to try. So, you know, it's little teeny steps. And then over time, as students find either that improvement in the family dynamic or improvement at school, as they find those little successes, that's what causes them to start to internalize some of these behaviors.
So true, Kathy. Karen asked about college students. Would they benefit from this, especially if they don't have Canvas? But I think what she means is maybe they don't utilize a learning management system.
We have a lot of college students. It's actually, I think too, personally, I think with, everything that happened with COVID, I think sort of that group of students that missed constant school, junior, senior year, going off to college, a lot of them are needing help right now. You get to college and there's a lot of distraction and there's no real set schedule and there are no bells and there's no teacher there saying you need to get this in. So there are a lot of, all of a sudden you go from a very structured environment to a very loose one. So it's a really appropriate time to have some coaching. And I also think a lot of colleges use some kind of learning management system. I don't know, it's not Canvas or Schoology, but they might have one that's specific to the college. But that would be the role then of the coach to sit down with the student and say, okay, you don't have one. So how are we going to manage this? We'll come up with our own calendar, our own planner. We'll make a Google Doc that we just keep adding to. So that would be the perfect situation for a coach to step in and facilitate that process.
Awesome. Melissa asks, do you find it helpful to tie school performance to participation in a big time commitment outside of school, like participation on a sports team? Meaning if you don't get good grades, you can't participate on a sports team. I think that's what she means.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a tough one, right? I'm struggling with this one, being a parent of an athlete. But here's one thing I will say that's a scientific fact is that students with ADHD, one of the best things you can do for them is to get them physical activity. There's absolutely no question. It's by far the best treatment for this disorder. So if you have a student or a child who has these issues, taking away the physical exercise, it's probably going to bite you in the butt in the long run, right? So, but there is some advantage to some kind of reward system. I personally like to reward for the good effort instead of punishing for a lack of, but that's a kind of a family decision, I think.
Thanks for that, Kathy. Yeah, and I also saw a study that students who play a sport have a higher GPA, probably because they have to manage their time better. They're forced to manage their time.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of my favorite strategies for those kids is we haven't talked about this, but it's something that we often share with kids is like identifying weird windows of time. And kids like that term, weird windows, because when you're a student athlete, you've got to like find these pockets of time because you don't have like 2 or 3 hours. And often that's what parents are worried about. If you're off playing a sport, you're not going to have these broad swaths of time to do your work. So right. You kind of like have to be a detective and find, where do I have these like little windows? It might be, well, on Tuesday, while I'm waiting for the bus for 45 minutes, I can get this thing done. And that's where that math comes in, and just like troubleshooting with kids and brainstorming, where can I find these pockets of time?
Yeah.
All right. So somebody says, let me look. I have 2 questions here. What about screen time and ADHD? Take the phone away forever? If too much on the screen, I realize it's an escape. Thoughts on that?
We hear this all the time. This is a big one. Again, it's a family decision. I mean, personally, as a parent, having been a teacher now in the role that I'm in, I do like to lessen screen time. It's very distracting. It's much more appealing, obviously, to students than doing the work. But there are a lot of apps out there now that you can set on your phone so that it forces you to focus for 30 minutes at a time or something, and then allows you to take a break and do something else. Things with phones like setting a timer, okay, if you work for 30 minutes, you can have 10 minutes on your phone. I think in this day and age, it's unrealistic to think that students won't have screen time, won't need the phone. A lot of times students need the phone even for academic work. But it is a balance. And again, it's if you find that it's really getting in the way, then it's your decision as a family to decide, that you might need to limit that time.
One thing I found helpful in talking to kids about it is asking them, does this get in your way? Because oftentimes with us, they're pretty honest. And they'll say, actually, it does. And so we
Yeah.
might say, oh, what are the alerts you're getting? Would unsubscribing to notifications, could that help? Sometimes we'll recommend, you mentioned a website blocker. There's tons of those out there. I can think of one that's called Stay Focused, which is a Chrome extension. There's a ton of them out there, but they all kind of do the same thing. You can either blacklist or whitelist. Blacklist sites you don't want to go to, or whitelist the sites you do want to go to.
Yeah.
So that is helpful to kids, because then you're saying, you know what, you're right. It's so hard to be focused when all these distractions are going on. Could this app help? Could this website blocker help? Let's try it for a couple of days and see how it goes. And then let's talk about it in our next session. But having those discussions with kids, even as a parent, I think is a really good approach, because often they know that it's kind of gone too far.
Yeah.
Let's see. Adrian said, can you share the time map template? And yes, we will send you a follow-up email tomorrow with this recording and all of the resources that you shared. Kathi, I think that we're out of questions right now. It was such a pleasure to work with you this evening. And thank you so much to all the parents that were on tonight. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And I wish you all the very best for the remainder of this fall and for your entire school year. Thank you for joining us. And again, please wait for the survey at the end. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks for having
Good
me.
night. Thanks, Kathi.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.